On a violent, stormy night, a barefoot little girl stood outside a billionaire's iron gate, shaking in the cold. When he stepped closer, she looked up through the rain and whispered, "Dad, do you remember me 7 years ago?" He buried his daughter. Tonight, the child he mourned was standing alive before him. The storm did not arrive quietly. It slammed into Blackwater Cove with the violence of a breaking ocean, rain slashing sideways across the empty coastal road as lightning tore the sky open in brief white fractures. Wind battered the tall iron gates of Ashbourne Point, where the cliffside estates of the wealthy stood like silent fortresses above the dark Atlantic. At 9:12 p.m., a long black sedan rolled slowly toward the Mercer estate. Inside the back seat sat Dorian Vale Mercer, 43 billionaire developer, a man known across New England for his precision, discipline, and distance. His tailored coat remained buttoned, though the car was warm. His phone rested dark in his hand. The driver slowed. Up ahead, the estate's security lights cut through the rain like pale knives. A voice crackled through the radio. "Sir, there's a situation at the gate." Dorian barely looked up. "What kind of situation?" The guard hesitated. "There's a child out here." The car slowed further. "A child," Dorian repeated. "Yes, sir. A little girl. She's been standing in the storm for nearly 20 minutes. The sedan's headlights swung toward the iron gate, and then Dorian saw her. A small figure clinging to the black bars, barefoot. Her thin, pale dress clung to her legs, soaked completely through. Blonde hair stuck to her face in wet strands, and the wind pushed her fragile body sideways with every violent gust. She looked impossibly small against the towering iron gate. Dorian frowned, confused. "What is she doing here?" The guard spoke again, his voice quieter now. "She says she's waiting for you, Mr. Mercer." Dorian's hand froze on the door handle. "For me, yes, sir." A pause. Then the guard added something that made the air inside the car suddenly feel colder. "She keeps asking if you remember her." Dorian stepped out into the storm. Rain hit him instantly, soaking the shoulders of his dark coat as the driver hurried to open an umbrella above him. But Dorian barely noticed the cold. His eyes were fixed on the small figure standing at the gate. Up close, she looked even smaller. The wind shoved rain across her face, yet she didn't move away. Her fingers gripped the iron bars as if they were the only solid thing left in the world. She could not have been older than 7. Her bare feet stood in shallow puddles that trembled with each gust of wind. The guard shifted uneasily behind Dorian. "Sir, we should probably call child services." But Dorian had stopped listening. The girl lifted her head slowly, and when their eyes met, something inside his chest tightened in a way he could not explain. Her eyes were a pale, impossible blue, not frightened, not pleading, searching, studying his face with a strange, aching intensity, as if she had waited a very long time to see it again. The storm roared around them. Then the girl spoke. Her voice was small, but steady. "Dad." The word struck Dorian like a physical blow. His breath caught. "Do you remember me?" For a moment, the entire world tilted. Rain faded into the background, and another memory rushed forward, bright hospital lights, the smell of antiseptic. A doctor's voice speaking carefully while grief hollowed out his chest. 7 years ago. The night his wife died. The night they told him his newborn daughter hadn't survived. Dorian swallowed hard. "That's not possible," he said quietly. The girl's expression fell, but she didn't look surprised. Behind him, the guard spoke again. "Sir, should we call the police?" At the word police, the girl flinched violently. Her hands tightened around the gate, and for the first time, real fear flashed across her face. "Please," the girl whispered. Her voice trembled now, the earlier steadiness cracking under the weight of exhaustion and cold. "Don't call them." The rain ran down her face, mixing with tears she seemed determined not to show. I won't stay long, she said quickly. I just needed to ask. Dorian stared at her. Up close, the details became impossible to ignore. The curve of her cheek, the slight tilt of her mouth when she frowned. Small features that felt disturbingly familiar, like half-remembered echoes of someone he had loved once. Someone he had buried. Behind him, the guard cleared his throat. Sir Protocol says Dorian raised a hand without looking back. Silence. His eyes never left the girl. What's your name? He asked. The girl hesitated. For a moment, it looked like she might say something else. Then she lowered her gaze. Maisie, she murmured. Dorian studied her carefully. Maisie what? Another hesitation. Maisie Hale. The last name meant nothing to him, yet something about the pause before she said it made the answer feel rehearsed. The wind slammed against the gate again, making the iron bars rattle. Maisie shivered violently now. She looked over her shoulder toward the dark road behind her, not with hope of leaving, but with a strange, anxious fear. As if whatever waited out there was worse than the storm. Dorian noticed, and suddenly the question in his mind changed. Not who is this child, but what is she running from? He exhaled slowly, then turned toward the guard. Open the gate. The guard blinked. Sir Dorian's voice dropped lower, steady and unmistakably firm. I said open it. The heavy iron gate groaned as it slowly began to swing inward. Maisie stared at the widening gap, uncertain. Then she stepped forward. And the moment she crossed the threshold of the Mercer estate, neither of their lives would ever be the same again. Warmth rushed toward them the moment the heavy front doors of the Mercer estate closed behind them. Inside, the foyer glowed with soft amber light reflecting off polished marble floors and tall glass windows overlooking the dark ocean. The storm outside still roared, but here everything felt strangely quiet. Too quiet. The little girl stood just inside the doorway, arms folded tightly across her chest. Someone from the staff handed her a towel and a thick sweater that hung far too large on her small frame. Dorian crouched down so he was level with her. What did you say your name was? He asked gently. Maisie, she replied. Maisie Hale. Her voice was careful, almost practiced. Dorian studied her face again. The resemblance to Eliza flickered through his mind, like lightning, quick, painful, impossible to ignore. Where are your parents, Maisie? He asked softly. The girl looked down at the floor. My mom died, she said. The words came quickly, as if she had said them many times before. A long time ago. Dorian nodded slowly. I'm sorry. Maisie shrugged faintly, but her fingers twisted the edge of the sweater nervously. And your father? Dorian asked. For several seconds, she didn't answer. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke in a quiet, flat voice. My father didn't want me. The sentence landed like a stone dropping into deep water. Dorian felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. That's not always the truth, he said carefully. Maisie suddenly looked up at him. Her pale blue eyes searched his face with desperate intensity. And before she could stop herself, the truth slipped out. You're my dad. The room went completely silent. Somewhere behind them, a clock ticked loudly on the wall. Dorian felt the world tilt. That's impossible, he whispered. But for the first time since she arrived, Maisie looked almost relieved. The words hung in the air like a fragile thread. You're my dad. Dorian stood slowly, every movement careful, as though sudden motion might shatter the moment completely. That can't be true, he said quietly. 7 years of grief rose up inside him all at once. He remembered the hospital. Bright white lights. The smell of antiseptic. Doctors speaking in calm, measured voices while the world collapsed around him. He remembered Eliza's hand slipping from his. He remembered the moment someone said the baby hadn't survived. And afterward, there had only been silence. Endless silence. Dorian forced himself back to the present. Maisie, he said gently, trying to keep his voice steady. My daughter died 7 years ago. The girl didn't argue. She didn't cry. Instead, her shoulders slumped slightly, as if she had expected that answer. "That's what Aunt Mara says too," she murmured. Dorian's eyes narrowed. Aunt Mara Maisie nodded. "She told me you didn't want me," the girl continued softly. "She said you told everyone I was gone." Dorian felt something cold spread through his chest. "That isn't true," he said immediately. Maisie looked up at him again. For the first time, real emotion cracked through her careful composure. "Then why didn't you come for me?" The question struck harder than anything else she had said. Dorian had no answer, because in his world the truth had always been simple. His daughter had died. But standing here now was a child with Eliza's eyes, and a voice that carried a quiet, devastating hope. The possibility crept into his mind slowly, terrifying, impossible. What if the worst day of his life had been built on a lie? Later, Maisie sat near the fireplace, wrapped in the oversized sweater and clutching a mug of hot chocolate in both hands. Steam rose gently into the warm air. For a moment, the storm outside faded into the background. Dorian sat across from her, watching quietly. Something about the way she held the mug, careful, protective, made his chest ache, like someone who had learned not to expect comfort. Maisie lifted the cup to drink. The sleeve of the sweater slipped down, and that was when Dorian saw it, a thin plastic bracelet around her wrist, yellowed with age. He leaned forward slightly. "Maisie," he said softly, "what's that on your wrist?" Her hand jerked back instinctively, but it was too late. Dorian had already seen enough to know it was not a toy. It was a hospital band. "Can I see it?" he asked gently. Maisie hesitated. Then slowly she extended her arm. The bracelet was old, cracked in places, but the faded ink was still readable. Dorian leaned closer, and then his breath stopped. Printed in small hospital lettering were 3 words. Baby Mercer, below it a location. Blackwater Women's Center, the exact hospital where Eliza had died. Dorian's mind went completely blank. "That bracelet," he whispered hoarsely. "Where did you get this?" Maisie shrugged helplessly. "I always had it. My aunt said it was nothing." She looked up at him uncertainly. "She told me it was just old trash from when I was a baby." But Dorian knew hospitals did not give out bracelets with family names by accident. His heart began pounding harder with every second. Because if that bracelet was real, then everything he believed about his daughter's death might be wrong. The room felt suddenly smaller. Dorian's eyes remained locked on the hospital bracelet around Maisie's wrist, as if the thin strip of plastic had just cracked open the past. But something else caught his attention, a faint glimmer of metal beneath the collar of the oversized sweater. A chain. "Maisie," he said quietly, "what's that around your neck?" Her hands flew up instantly, clutching the necklace. Fear flashed across her face. "I didn't steal it," she said quickly. "I promise." Dorian softened his voice. "I'm not accusing you. I just want to see it." Maisie studied him carefully, as if weighing whether he could be trusted. Then slowly she unclasped the chain and placed the small object in his hand. It was an old silver locket. The hinge was stiff with age. Dorian opened it, and the world seemed to stop again. Inside was a tiny photograph, faded and creased at the edges, but unmistakable. It was him, standing beside Eliza Wren Mercer on the courthouse steps on their wedding day, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. That photo had once hung in their bedroom. It had disappeared shortly after Eliza's funeral. "Where did you get this?" Dorian asked hoarsely. Maisie looked down at the rug. "I found it," she whispered. "Found it where? In my aunt's room." She swallowed nervously. "There's a drawer that gets stuck. When I pulled it open, the bottom board came loose." Her small hands mimicked the motion. There were old papers behind it, and this was taped under the wood. Dorian's fingers tightened around the locket. Someone hadn't just hidden the truth. Someone had buried it. Maisie watched him carefully. There was something else, too, she said quietly. Dorian looked up. What do you mean? She reached for her backpack. The small worn bag never left her side, even when she slept. She opened the zipper slowly and pulled out a folded piece of paper, edges softened with age. I found this with the necklace, she said. But I didn't know what it meant. Dorian unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting hit him like lightning. He would recognize it anywhere. Eliza's handwriting. Elegant, soft, alive. The note was short. Just a few lines written in dark ink. If anything happens to me, please make sure our daughter grows up knowing she was loved from the very beginning. Dorian's vision blurred. His chest tightened so suddenly he had to sit down. Eliza had written this before the birth, before the hospital, before everything fell apart. Maisie watched him anxiously. Is it bad? She asked softly. Dorian shook his head slowly. No. His voice was barely a whisper. It's not bad. But it was devastating, because the note proved something he had never considered. Eliza had believed their child would live. She had trusted that someone would protect her. Dorian looked at Maisie again, at her pale blue eyes, at the bracelet, at the locket, at the fragile child sitting in front of him who looked more like Eliza with every passing minute. The truth was no longer a distant possibility. It was standing right in front of him. And suddenly Dorian understood something terrifying. 7 years ago, someone hadn't just lied to him. Someone had stolen his daughter. Maisie fell asleep on the couch sometime after midnight. The oversized sweater swallowed her small frame, and the backpack remained clutched loosely against her chest, as if it were the only possession she trusted not to disappear. Dorian stood in the doorway of his study watching her. The firelight flickered softly across her face. For a moment she looked almost peaceful, but even in sleep her brow twitched occasionally, as though fear had followed her into dreams. Dorian turned back toward his desk. 3 objects lay in front of him. The hospital bracelet, the silver locket, Eliza's folded note. Each piece alone might have been coincidence. Together they formed something far more dangerous. Truth. He opened the old legal folder he had not touched in 7 years. The label still read, Estate of Eliza Mercer. Inside were hospital reports, insurance documents, guardianship paperwork, and everywhere in neat professional handwriting. One name, Gideon Pike. Dorian remembered Pike clearly, his attorney at the time, the man who had stood beside him in the hospital while doctors spoke in careful voices, the man who had said, I'll handle everything. You shouldn't have to deal with this right now. Dorian's jaw tightened, because for the first time in 7 years, the sentence sounded different. Not comforting, convenient. He closed the folder slowly, then looked back toward the living room. Maisie shifted slightly in her sleep, a quiet, fragile child who had walked through a storm to find him. Dorian exhaled slowly. If what he feared was true, then someone had stolen 7 years of his daughter's life, and he was going to find out who, no matter what it cost. Morning came slowly over Blackwater Cove. A pale gray light spread across the ocean, turning the restless waves into sheets of dull silver. Inside the Mercer estate, the silence felt different than usual, not empty, charged. Dorian Mercer stood in the kitchen while coffee brewed untouched beside him. Across the room, Maisie sat quietly at the island counter, her small hands wrapped around a mug of warm milk. She looked smaller in daylight, fragile, but real. Too real. Dorian had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same things: the bracelet, the locket, Eliza's note. 7 years of certainty had collapsed overnight. Now there was only one place to start: the hospital. 2 hours later, Dorian parked outside Blackwater Women's Center, the same hospital where Eliza had died. The building looked unchanged. Cold glass, steel doors, neutral colors designed to soften grief. Maisie stayed close beside him as they walked inside. "Are we in trouble?" she whispered. "No," Dorian said gently. "We're looking for answers." They were directed to the records department, where an older physician named Dr. Elias Rowan greeted them with cautious curiosity. Dorian placed the bracelet on the desk. Dr. Rowan studied it carefully. His expression shifted. "Where did you get this?" "It was on her wrist," Dorian said. Dr. Rowan looked at Maisie, then back at the bracelet. "This ID number," he murmured. He turned to his computer and began typing. The room filled with the soft clicking of keys. Seconds passed. Then Dr. Rowan leaned closer to the screen. His voice lowered. "This admission code belongs to a newborn from 7 years ago." Dorian felt his pulse hammer. "Does the record show the child died?" Dr. Rowan hesitated. "No." The word landed like thunder. The infant survived the delivery. Dorian's breath stopped. Dr. Rowan continued slowly. The mother died from complications. Dorian already knew that part. But what came next shattered everything. "You were sedated during the emergency, Dr. Rowan said carefully. "You were legally incapacitated for several hours." Dorian's stomach turned. During that time, the doctor continued a legal representative assumed authority over medical decisions. Dorian already knew the name before the doctor said it. Gideon Pike. Dr. Rowan nodded, and shortly afterward he said a guardianship request was filed. Dorian's voice felt distant when he spoke. By whom, the doctor read from the screen. Mara Quinn Hale. Dorian looked at Maisie, at the child standing beside him, alive, and suddenly he understood something horrifying. His daughter had never died. She had been taken. The air inside Dr. Rowan's office felt heavy with disbelief. Dorian stood motionless, staring at the glowing screen. "Run that again," he said quietly. Dr. Rowan didn't argue. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, opening archived files that had not been viewed in years. Hospital records appeared one by one. Admission logs, delivery reports, neonatal transfer forms, and every line confirmed the same truth. The infant had survived. Stable condition. Transferred to neonatal care. Expected full recovery. Dorian leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk. "Then why," he asked slowly, "was I told my daughter died?" Dr. Rowan exhaled. "I can't answer that." He scrolled further. "However, the record shows that within 48 hours, legal guardianship paperwork was submitted." Dorian already knew the name, but hearing it aloud made his blood run cold. Mara Quinn Hale, Maisie's aunt. Dr. Rowan continued reading. The petition stated the father was emotionally unstable and unwilling to assume care. Maisie shifted nervously beside Dorian. "That's not true," she whispered. Dorian placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "No," he said. "It isn't." Dr. Rowan scrolled further. Then his expression darkened. "There's something else." Dorian braced himself. 2 months later, the doctor said a report was filed stating the child had died in a residential fire. Maisie looked confused. A fire. Dr. Rowan nodded. The guardianship case was closed after that report. Dorian's voice hardened. "Was the body ever returned to the hospital?" Dr. Rowan checked the system again. "No. No autopsy. No death confirmation through our records." The doctor leaned back slowly. "That means the hospital never verified the death." Silence fell over the room. Dorian felt something inside him snap into focus. For 7 years he had believed grief was the end of his story, but grief had only been the cover. Behind it was something darker, something deliberate. Someone had taken control while he was sedated. Filed paperwork, declared his daughter dead, and walked away with her life. Dorian looked down at Maisie, the little girl who had crossed a storm to find him. Then he spoke with a quiet, controlled fury. This wasn't an accident. Dr. Rowan nodded slowly. No, he said. I don't believe it was. Dorian Mercer made one phone call the moment he left the hospital. The call lasted less than 30 seconds. Meet me at the estate, he said. I need you to look at something. The man who arrived an hour later was Nathaniel Cross, Dorian's oldest friend and the only lawyer he had trusted since dismissing Gideon Pike years ago. Nathaniel stepped into the study and immediately sensed the tension in the room. Dorian, he said quietly. What happened? Dorian slid the hospital bracelet across the desk. Nathaniel frowned. Then Dorian placed the locket beside it. And finally, Eliza's folded note. Start reading, Dorian said. Nathaniel did. 10 minutes later, his expression had completely changed. This is serious, he said. That's not even the worst part, Dorian replied. He handed over the hospital report Dr. Rowan had printed. Nathaniel read it carefully. When he finished, he leaned back slowly in his chair. So the child survived, he said. Yes. And Pike had legal authority while you were sedated. Yes. Nathaniel tapped the paper thoughtfully. Then someone had control of every decision made that night. Dorian's voice dropped. Find out who paid him. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. You think there was money involved? I know there was. Nathaniel pulled out his laptop and began digging into old financial records connected to Pike's law firm. The room filled with the soft rhythm of typing. Maisie sat quietly on the couch nearby, clutching her backpack. After several minutes, Nathaniel stopped. Well, he said slowly. That didn't take long. Dorian looked up. What did you find? Nathaniel turned the laptop around. On the screen was a series of financial transfers, consulting payments, large ones, all routed through a legal account connected to Gideon Pike, source Dorian asked. Nathaniel pointed to the originating firm, a legal office registered under one name, Mara Quinn Hale. Dorian's jaw tightened. Nathaniel closed the laptop. This isn't just custody fraud, he said. This could be conspiracy. Dorian looked toward the living room where Maisie sat watching them nervously. 7 years of silence had just begun to unravel, and the truth waiting underneath it was far more dangerous than grief. Dorian stood slowly. Good, he said. Then let's start pulling the thread. The waiting area at North Essex Child Services buzzed with a restless fluorescent hum that made every movement feel louder than it should have been. Metal chairs scraped against the floor whenever someone shifted, and a tired poster about safe homes peeled slightly at the corners of the wall. Dorian Mercer sat upright with his hands loosely clasped together, his posture calm but alert in the way of a man used to controlling chaos through discipline. Beside him sat Maisie, small and quiet, her shoulder pressed against his arm as if she were anchoring herself to something solid after years of uncertainty. She held the strap of her backpack with both hands, twisting the fabric slowly. Every time a door opened down the hall, her body stiffened. They're not going to make me go back tonight, are they? She whispered, barely moving her lips. Dorian leaned down slightly, so only she could hear him. No one is making any decisions without hearing from you, he said softly. And I'm right here. She nodded, though her grip on his sleeve tightened. The door to the hallway burst open suddenly, and the quiet waiting room fractured. A woman rushed in, soaked from the rain, her hair pulled back too tightly, as if she had done it while running. Mara Quinn Hale moved with a mixture of anger and panic that filled the room before she even spoke. Her eyes scanned the chairs until they landed on Maisie. For a brief moment, something like relief crossed her face, but it vanished instantly, replaced by fury, as she noticed Dorian beside her. There he is, Mara snapped, pointing toward him, as if she had discovered a criminal hiding in plain sight. That's the man who took her. Conversations around the room died instantly. Maisie shrank back in her chair, her body reacting before her mind could. Years of habit pulled her toward Mara. The woman had been the one who carried her through fevers and cold nights, who had sung to her when the electricity went out. For a second, Maisie's shoulders tilted in that direction, but then Dorian's arm came around her instinctively, not restraining her, but creating a quiet barrier of protection. She felt it and stayed where she was. "You never wanted her," Mara continued, loudly pacing closer, as if sheer volume might change the truth. 7 years you disappeared. 7 years I raised her while you were off building skyscrapers and pretending your family never existed. Dorian did not respond immediately. The accusations landed heavily because there was pain buried inside them, even if the larger story was built on lies. A calm voice interrupted before the tension could explode further. Jenna Sloan, the child services caseworker, stepped forward with a clipboard tucked under her arm. "Ms. Hale, we're going to move this into a conference room," she said evenly. "Everyone will have the opportunity to speak." Inside the room, the air felt cooler, more controlled. The table was scarred from years of meetings, and the fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly. Mara dropped into a chair with her arms crossed tightly, while Dorian remained standing until Jenna gestured for him to sit. Maisie took the seat closest to the wall, drawing her knees slightly inward, as if she could make herself smaller. Jenna began calmly explaining the purpose of the meeting, an emergency placement review, to determine immediate safety for the child involved. Mara let out a bitter laugh. "Safety," she said sharply. "I kept her alive when no one else did." Dorian finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "This isn't about destroying you," he said. "It's about finding out what really happened." The room grew quiet again, and in that silence the fragile balance of the next hour settled into place. For the first time since the stormy night outside his gates, Dorian realized the truth was no longer just a personal mystery. It was about to become a legal battle, and every word spoken in this room would begin shaping the future of the little girl sitting between them. Jenna Sloan placed both hands on the table and spoke with the calm tone of someone who had guided many frightened families through moments like this. "Maisie," she said gently, "can you tell us why you went to Mr. Mercer's house last night?" The question seemed simple, but the room grew so quiet that the faint ticking of a wall clock sounded almost deafening. Maisie's fingers tightened around the sleeve of the borrowed sweater she still wore. She glanced first at the floor, then toward Mara, and finally toward Dorian. Her eyes searched his face the way a child searches the horizon for a lighthouse in a storm. Dorian did not speak. He simply nodded once, small and reassuring, letting her know she did not have to face the moment alone. Maisie took a slow breath, though her voice trembled when she began. "He didn't take me," she said quietly. "I went to him." Mara immediately slammed her hand on the table. "Don't lie," she snapped. But Jenna raised a firm hand, without looking away from the child. "Let her finish." Maisie swallowed and continued. "Aunt Mara told me my dad didn't want me." She said, her voice barely above a whisper, but growing steadier with each sentence. "She said he told everyone I was gone, that he didn't care." Her eyes dropped again as she spoke, the words sounding rehearsed, because they had lived inside her mind for years. "But I found something," she continued. She explained about the drawer that stuck in Mara's bedroom, the board that had come loose when she pulled too hard, and the small hidden space beneath it, where old cords and papers had been stuffed out of sight. She described finding the locket first, then the photograph inside it of Dorian and Eliza smiling on courthouse steps she had never seen before. Then she mentioned the bracelet she had worn since she could remember, and the folded note written in Eliza's handwriting. As she spoke, the adults in the room listened with growing stillness. Even Mara's angry expression shifted slightly as the truth spilled out piece by fragile piece. Maisie's voice cracked once when she reached the end. "I thought, maybe if he didn't want me, he wouldn't hide something like that," she said. "And if he did want me, then maybe someone lied. The sentence hung in the air like fragile glass. Dorian felt something tighten painfully behind his ribs. Maisie lifted her chin slightly, then forcing herself to say the final reason she had walked alone through the storm the night before. "I didn't go there to hurt anyone," she said softly. "I just wanted to ask him why he never came back for me." Her words were simple, but they carried a quiet power that no lawyer's argument could match. Even Mara looked shaken now, the anger draining from her face as something heavier replaced it, guilt, fear, and perhaps the first recognition that the story she had built for years was collapsing. Dorian finally spoke, sliding the folder of documents across the table toward Jenna. "I have records from the hospital," he said, "medical files, guardianship paperwork, and financial transfers connected to Gideon Pike." His voice remained controlled, but the tension beneath it was unmistakable. "7 years ago, I was told my daughter died. It turns out she didn't." The room seemed to shrink as everyone absorbed the implication. A lie had not only been told, it had been maintained for years. By the time they returned to the Mercer estate that evening, the rain had softened into a quiet mist that drifted across the cliffs like smoke. The house felt different now. For years, it had been a silent monument to grief, every hallway too large, every room too empty. But as Maisie stepped inside again, something subtle changed in the atmosphere, as if the building itself were remembering what it felt like to hold a family. Jenna Sloan had already inspected the home earlier that afternoon and approved temporary placement for the night until a formal court hearing could take place the following day. Once she left, the enormous house fell quiet again, leaving only Dorian and Maisie standing near the staircase. Maisie glanced upward uncertainly. "Where should I sleep?" she asked softly. Dorian hesitated for a moment before answering, aware that even a simple choice might feel overwhelming after the day they had just endured. "I set up a room near my study," he said. "It's smaller than the others. Warmer." He led her down a quiet hallway where a guest room had been prepared with soft yellow lighting and a small bed beneath a window seat piled with pillows. Maisie stepped inside, cautiously touching the edge of the blanket with careful fingers, as if she expected the room to disappear. Later that night, she changed into new pajamas someone from the staff had purchased earlier in the day, pale blue with tiny white stars. Dorian waited outside the door until she called softly that she was ready. When she came out, her damp hair hung in soft waves around her face. She looked younger, somehow, less guarded. Dorian picked up a brush from the dresser and hesitated. "May I?" he asked. Maisie blinked, surprised by the question, then nodded. He sat beside her on the window seat and gently worked through the knots in her hair, moving slowly whenever the brush caught. The room remained quiet, except for the soft sound of the bristles and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs below. After a long pause, Maisie spoke without turning around. "Why didn't you come for me?" The question was quiet, but direct. Dorian felt the weight of it settle in his chest. "Because I believed a lie," he said finally, "and believing it was the worst mistake of my life." Maisie stared down at her hands for a long moment. "I waited every birthday," she whispered. The words were so small they might have vanished in the silence, but Dorian heard them clearly. His throat tightened as he realized what those years must have felt like for her. When she climbed into bed later, she reached out and took his hand briefly before closing her eyes. "Don't disappear again," she murmured sleepily. Dorian sat beside the bed until her breathing slowed into steady rhythm. Outside, the ocean wind carried away the last of the rain, and for the first time in 7 years, the house did not feel empty. It felt like something fragile had returned, something worth fighting for. Morning arrived with a pale winter light spreading slowly across the cliffs of Blackwater Cove. The Mercer estate felt unusually alive as Dorian and Maisie prepared to leave for court, the quiet routines of breakfast carrying a fragile sense of importance neither of them fully spoke about. Maisie ate carefully, concentrating on each bite of toast, as if the simple act of finishing breakfast required courage. Dorian noticed the small tremor in her hands and slid a glass of orange juice toward her without comment. When she finished, she slipped her hand into his, automatically, the movement so natural it surprised both of them. The drive to Essex County Family Court took less than 20 minutes, but every mile felt heavier than the last. The courthouse stood in the center of town, a gray stone building with tall columns and narrow windows that reflected the cold morning sky. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, and the echo of footsteps along the marble hallway made Maisie's grip on Dorian's hand tighten slightly. Nathaniel Cross was already waiting near the courtroom doors, a stack of neatly organized files tucked under his arm. "Everything is ready," he said quietly as they approached. "Hospital records, financial transfers, the guardianship documents. If Pike manipulated this case the way we think he did, it will show." Dorian nodded once, though his attention remained on Maisie. She stared at the tall courtroom doors, as if they were the entrance to something far larger than she had expected. "You remember what we talked about?" he asked softly. She nodded, though her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Just tell the truth." Dorian crouched slightly so their eyes were level. "That's all anyone should ever ask of you." The courtroom itself felt colder than the hallway outside. Long wooden benches stretched across the room and sunlight filtered through the high windows in pale bands that illuminated floating specks of dust. At the front sat the judge's bench, imposing and still. Mara Quinn Hale was already seated at the opposite table, her shoulders stiff and her eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. When she noticed Maisie enter with Dorian, her expression flickered with something complicated. Anger, regret, fear, all tangled together. Maisie instinctively slowed her steps, but Dorian placed a steady hand on her shoulder and guided her forward. Nathaniel arranged the documents on the table with quiet precision, while the court clerk called the session to order. As the judge entered and everyone rose, Dorian realized something profound. For 7 years, he had lived under the weight of grief, believing the story of his daughter had ended before it ever began. Now the truth stood only a few feet away from him, small and nervous, but impossibly alive. And the doors of the courtroom had just closed behind them, sealing the past and the future into the same room. The courtroom settled into silence once the judge began reviewing the case summary. Her voice calm and measured as she outlined the purpose of the hearing. Temporary custodial placement for the minor child Maisie Hale, and review of allegations involving false guardianship documentation and possible fraud. Nathaniel Cross rose first, moving with quiet confidence as he approached the bench. He began by presenting the medical records recovered from Blackwater Women's Center, explaining the timeline of Eliza Mercer's delivery and death, while emphasizing that the infant listed under the hospital ID baby, Mercer, had survived the procedure and been transferred to neonatal care in stable condition. The judge's brow furrowed slightly as she read the document. Nathaniel continued methodically, placing each piece of evidence before her: the hospital bracelet recovered from Maisie's wrist, the archived admission codes confirming the child's identity, and the guardianship petition filed 2 days later by Mara Quinn Hale. Across the room, Mara shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The petition stated that Mr. Mercer was emotionally unstable and unwilling to assume responsibility, Nathaniel said calmly. However, hospital staff confirmed Mr. Mercer was under heavy sedation and incapable of making legal decisions at that time. The judge glanced toward Dorian briefly before turning back to the file. "And the death report?" she asked. Nathaniel opened another folder. 2 months later, a residential fire report listed the infant as deceased. However, the hospital never received a body and no autopsy or verification was conducted through the medical system. The courtroom murmured quietly before the judge raised a hand for silence. Dorian stood when he was asked to speak, his voice steady, though the weight of 7 lost years pressed heavily against his chest. "Your Honor," he said, "I was told my daughter died the night my wife did. I signed documents while grieving and trusted the people advising me." Nathaniel then revealed the final layer of the investigation: financial transfers, discovered in Gideon Pike's legal accounts, routed from a consulting firm connected to Mara Quinn Hale. The numbers spoke louder than accusations. The judge leaned back, slowly absorbing the implication that the case was not merely about custody, but about deception carried out over years. Maisie watched the adults speak around her, the words complicated, but the emotions clear enough to understand. For the first time, the truth she had carried alone was being spoken out loud in a room full of people who could no longer ignore it. The tension in the courtroom shifted when Mara Quinn Hale finally stood from her chair. Her composure had been crumbling slowly throughout the hearing, and now the carefully maintained anger that had fueled her earlier accusations seemed to drain away all at once. "I didn't plan it like that," she said suddenly, her voice unsteady but loud enough to echo across the silent room. Everyone turned toward her. The judge watched carefully without interrupting. Mara ran a hand through her hair, as though struggling to untangle years of decisions she could no longer hide behind. "When Eliza died, I didn't know what to do," she continued, her voice trembling. "The baby was there and Dorian was broken, completely gone. The lawyers were handling everything." She glanced briefly toward Dorian before looking away again. "Gideon Pike told me the child would be better off with family. He said if I filed for guardianship, the paperwork would be simple, that Dorian wouldn't fight it because he thought the baby had died." Nathaniel watched her closely, but did not interrupt. Mara swallowed hard. "At first I thought it was temporary, but the bills kept coming. Rent, food, doctors. I didn't have the money. Pike said the estate settlement could be delayed if things got complicated." Her voice cracked slightly. "So I did what he told me." The room remained silent as she continued the confession, unraveling years of deception. The fire report was his idea. He said it would close the case permanently and keep anyone from asking questions. She looked toward Maisie then, and the anger that had once defined her expression was replaced by something far more fragile. "I did take care of you," she whispered. "Maybe not the way I should have, but I tried." Maisie didn't answer. She simply watched, her small face unreadable, as the truth unfolded piece by piece. The judge finally spoke again, her voice firm but not cruel. "Ms. Hale, your admission confirms serious misconduct and potential fraud. This court will require further investigation into the role of Gideon Pike and any financial arrangements connected to this case." She then turned toward Dorian. "For now, the priority remains the welfare of the child." Dorian nodded slowly, understanding that the legal battle was not finished, but had finally begun to move in the direction of truth. In the quiet that followed, Maisie glanced up at him briefly, her hand finding his again beneath the table. For the first time since entering the courtroom, her grip felt steady. When the judge finally turned her attention toward the small girl seated beside Dorian Mercer, the entire courtroom seemed to quiet in anticipation. The adults had spent nearly an hour discussing legal authority, hospital records, financial transfers, and years of deception. But the center of the case, the child whose life had been shaped by those decisions, had not yet spoken. Jenna Sloan gently knelt beside Maisie and whispered that she could say as much or as little as she felt comfortable with. Maisie nodded slowly, though her hands remained folded tightly in her lap. For a moment she simply stared at the polished wooden floor, as if gathering courage from somewhere deep inside herself. When she finally spoke, her voice was small but clear. She explained that she had not gone to Dorian's house to accuse anyone or cause trouble. She had gone because she wanted to understand something that had followed her every day of her life. "Aunt Mara said my dad didn't want me," she said softly, her eyes lifting toward the judge. "She said he told everyone I was gone." Her gaze shifted briefly to Dorian before returning forward. "But I found the picture and the bracelet and the note my mom wrote." She swallowed, then continued with a fragile honesty that seemed to fill the entire room. "I thought if he didn't want me, he wouldn't hide something like that. And if he did want me, maybe someone lied." The judge watched her carefully. So you went to find him. Maisie nodded. I just wanted to ask why he never came back. Her words carried no anger, only the quiet weight of years spent waiting for someone who had never known she was still there. The room remained silent after she finished speaking. Even Mara looked shaken, her shoulders sinking, as if the truth had become impossible to deny. Dorian felt Maisie's small hand reach for his beneath the table, and he closed his fingers gently around hers, understanding that the moment she had feared most had just passed. The judge sat in thoughtful silence for several moments after Maisie finished speaking, carefully reviewing the documents spread across her desk. The courtroom remained still, the only sound the faint rustle of paper and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Finally, she looked up, her expression firm but measured. This court recognizes that the evidence presented raises serious concerns regarding the guardianship actions taken 7 years ago, she said. The role of Gideon Pike in those decisions will be referred for formal investigation. She paused briefly before continuing. However, the immediate matter before this court is the welfare and safety of the minor child. Her gaze shifted toward Dorian Mercer. Mr. Mercer, the records confirm that you were misled regarding the survival of your daughter, and the testimony provided today suggests that the child has a clear emotional attachment to you. Maisie's fingers tightened around Dorian's hand as the judge continued. Effective immediately, temporary custody of Maisie Mercer is granted to Mr. Dorian Mercer, pending further review. The court will require counseling and ongoing supervision during the adjustment period, but the child will remain under Mr. Mercer's care. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, before their meaning fully settled. Maisie blinked, her expression uncertain. Does that mean I can stay with him? She whispered. The judge nodded gently. Yes. The answer broke something open inside the room. Maisie turned toward Dorian with wide, disbelieving eyes. He knelt beside her chair, placing his hands carefully on her shoulders. You were always meant to, he said softly. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around him, burying her face against his coat. For the first time since walking into the courthouse, the tension in Dorian's chest loosened slightly. Across the room, Mara lowered her head, silent tears slipping down her face as the reality of the moment settled in. The past had finally been spoken aloud, and the future, uncertain but hopeful, had begun. Several months later, the air in Blackwater Cove felt softer, the harsh winter winds replaced by the gentle warmth of early spring. In the quiet garden behind St. Bridget's Chapel, Dorian Mercer knelt beside a simple stone engraved with the name Eliza Wren Mercer. Maisie stood beside him, holding a single white daisy she had picked from the garden path. She placed the flower carefully at the base of the stone and looked down at it for a long moment before speaking. Do you think Mom would be mad at you? She asked quietly. Dorian glanced at her with mild surprise. Why would she be mad? Maisie shrugged slightly. Because you didn't find me sooner. Dorian took a slow breath, his gaze drifting toward the ocean visible beyond the chapel walls. No, he said gently. I think she would just be happy that we found each other at all. Maisie nodded thoughtfully. Around her neck hung the silver locket she had discovered months earlier, though now the picture inside had been replaced with a new photograph of the two of them standing on the steps of the Mercer estate. The old hospital bracelet that had once seemed like a meaningless piece of plastic now rested in a small glass frame on Dorian's bedside table at home. It was no longer a relic of loss. It was a reminder of the truth that had finally come to light. As they walked slowly through the garden toward the parking lot, a light rain began to fall, soft and warm compared to the violent storm that had first brought Maisie to his gates. She glanced up at him with a shy smile. Dad, she said. Dorian felt the word settle warmly in his chest, still new and precious each time he heard it. Yes, Maisie tilted her head slightly. Do you remember me now? Dorian squeezed her hand gently. I remember everything that matters. Together they walked toward the road, leaving the past behind them, while the quiet promise of a new life stretched ahead. Did this story leave a lasting impression on you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, rate it from 1 to 10, and tap the end screen to see another heartwarming story waiting for you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, then tap the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories. Until our next